Erran Carmel. I teach information technology at the Business School at American University in Washington. I'll give you some coordinates. I'm at GMT -5. Remember, I'm doing time zones. My longitude is -77. I'm about 6 kilometers from the White House, so you have some idea of where I am. You're going to get a copy of my book. It's really hot off the press. The special printing that Rini managed here in the last few days in the Netherlands is actually the very first printing of this book. I have copy number 1 back in Washington, but you have copy number 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 of this book. But much more important, since paper isn't really that important anymore, it became official on Monday. On Monday, it appeared on Amazon for the first time. So this was really special. And so it is hot off the press. I wrote this book with my colleague at American University, Alberto Espinosa, who's also a professor with me. All right, so here's the problem. All of you here in this room, presumably all of you are global software engineers or involved in global teams in one way or another, are working in these kind of structures. Some of you are in clusters, some of you are working individually. This is a management problem, of course. And the main global fault lines are these. These are the same as we've had for the last 15 years. There are cultural differences, there are language differences, there are organizational differences. All right, so I was telling you about the 5 global fault lines. There's culture, there's language, there are organizational differences. All of these are important. I want to focus on a little bit on distance, and of course on that big word in the middle, on time. Can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, okay, good. All right, the problem is that to some extent there's confusion about time. And when Alberto Espinosa and I, who had been researching global software development for many years, when we got together, when he joined my department, we looked at this problem of managing over distance, over time in global organizations. And we identified time zones specifically as an area that's been neglected, still is, and that's why we wrote the book. But one of the issues is that there's a confounding of distance and time. So since the 1990s, since the internet took off, we've said that distance is dead. There's a well-known book by Carncross called Distance is Dead. We all repeat this mantra. We're all technologists. And so the confounding is that since distance is dead, then certainly time, in other words, temporal issues, are dead as well. But let me remind you of something that you know quite well, is that distance and time are not the same thing. Here's the distance and time zone difference between London and 2 locations on the globe. This is obvious to you, but I just want to underline it because it's an important issue in understanding how time zones have been neglected from a managerial perspective. Okay, we're going to do a poll here. Time zone differences, are they good or are they bad? Everybody in the room has to vote once. Rini, come and help me count. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question here. Please vote once, but only once. Let me pose the dilemma to you. The dilemma is this: time zone differences. There are clearly opportunities with time zone differences. There are clearly problems with time zone differences. The communications difficulties create delay. You're waiting for somebody in a faraway continent to respond to you because they're sleeping right now. So that's the downside of time zone differences. On the other hand, there are opportunities, usually known as follow the sun. Follow the sun is the concept that at the end of the day, after I've worked all day long, I hand off work to another continent, typically west of me, and they continue working, and so we speed up the process. So we're working faster. So really, where is the core of the time zone issue? Is it the opportunity of working faster, or is it the problem of working slower? It can't be both, or maybe it can. So, votes. How many of you think that time zone differences create difficulties? All right. How many of you think that time zone differences create speed up and opportunities? Okay. Oh, so a number of you are voting more than once.
40, 60%, around. 60% bad, 40% good.
All right, so in case you were wondering what I think time zone differences certainly have given opportunity, I'm going to come back to follow the sun, because follow the sun and round the clock are opportunities. But by and large, time zone differences create problems, managerial problems, team problems. Let me tell you why. We have difficulties because of two opposing forces which are immovable. We cannot fix these, not in our lifetimes. And the two opposing forces are sleep and convergence. I want to talk briefly about each one. Sleep is very familiar to you. We human beings are programmed to live in 24-hour circadian cycles, like all multicellular creatures, including even little jellyfish. We work on 24-hour cycles, and we tend to like to work during the day and to sleep at night. So that's one. We can't really change that. Again, at least not in our lifetimes. The other issue that is very difficult for us to change is this. We like to be close, and we need to be close. Now, why do we like to be close? We know about that, but let's talk about the work situation. We need to be close because we needed to do complex tasks, unstructured tasks. We needed to generate ideas. Yesterday in the discussion with some of you here, we talked about the fuzzy part of the process. We needed to resolve disagreements, and in order to do that, we need to have interactive communication. We need to do it either by voice or by some quick communication back and forth in real time at the same time. So these are the two opposing forces. We can't move them, we can't fix them, and that's why the time zone issues are acute. If we don't converge, if we don't, I'm going to come back to the idea of convergence, if we don't talk to each other, then our work looks like this. We're passing the baton from one person in one time zone to the next person in a different time zone, and that is a very difficult managerial process. All right, so with that as background, let me tell you about the 10 things that every global software engineer needs to know about time zones. This is the list of 10. I'll go through them very quickly, one at a time. The first is time zone literacy. All right, so here's a map that you all know. These maps, they portray to us how wonderful the world has become, how globalized it is, how networked it is. So let me do a little bit of a trivia quiz with you. Let's look at the big countries. Russia, the United States, China, and India. How many time zones in Russia? 11. Every Russian who grew up under the USSR knows how great and big the USSR was because it covered 11 time zones. But 2 years ago, President Medvedev put Russia on a time zone diet, and they lost one time zone. So now they're down to 10. How about the United States? 4 in the continental United States, and if you add Alaska and Hawaii, you're up to 6. How about China? Just 1. When Mao Zedong came into power 60 years ago, he said time zones is for capitalists, and he abolished them. India, how many time zones? 1, just 1. It's a smaller country, of course, than China, but it only has 1. They've been discussing splitting up India into more time zones, but it's never been very serious. Now, beyond time zones, there are other coordination problems that I want to underline just briefly, and they are a list that you're all familiar with, but they need to be put on the table. People in different places, they work different hours of the day. If you're from a Latino country, then you often have a siesta in the middle of the day. And so your work hours are different. The breaks for lunch are different. Some places also break for other reasons, prayer, for example. Remember, all of these create coordination problems in addition to time zones. There's different weekends. In Christian countries, the weekends, of course, are Saturday and Sunday, but in Muslim and Jewish countries, they're Friday and Saturday. Holidays are different, obviously, but you also need to know when people actually stop working, even though officially they come to work. For example, in America, no one gets any work done after December 15th. And if you're from a non-Christian country, it doesn't say that on your calendar, right? But people come to work, they don't actually work. Vacations. Vacations are different. In America, we take very short vacations. In the Netherlands, you typically take longer vacations. You have a healthier lifestyle in that sense. And then there's the difference in equatorial differences when people take their summer vacation versus their big work cycle. So this is number one. Number two, let's move on to configurations. Let me introduce you to the basic time zone configurations. I'm going to blow this up in a moment. Alberto and I identified basically 6 time zone configurations in global knowledge work. We mostly study, like you, global software engineering. So let's look at the first 3. First 3 are rather obvious. You can either be co-located east-west or north-south. Each one of those rows represents one person in one site. And of course, the columns represent the 24 hours of the day. So this is a fairly standard representation. And then we have the more complicated one. We have clustered, bridged, and far-flung. Let's start from the bottom, far-flung. This is the messy configuration that some of you are working in. Everybody is in a different time zone. Bridged is actually, those of you who are in this business, you know that this actually happens a lot, where there's typically one ambassador or liaison, as I like to call him, who bridges the time zones between 2 sites that are far apart. And up at the top we have clustered. We have one central location where most of the people are, and then we have a few others, small teams or individuals scattered about. Now, why is this useful? It's useful because if you've worked in one of these 6 configurations and you've had successes or failures, you can take those successes and failures to the next time you work in that configuration, because the technologies, the methods, the managerial issues that you use are going to be similar. Let's look at number 3, time shifting. Time shifting is actually probably the most important one, and I want to spend a couple of minutes on this. Time shifting is when somebody adjusts their hours to your hours. They might be many time zones away. So let me show you graphically. It looks like this. So here we have the orange individual or the orange team adjusting their hours to somebody else's hours, in this case the yellow grouping here. The overlap we call the convergence window. I'll explain why in just a moment. So time shifting. Now time shifting is very, very common. In fact, I don't visit any global software engineers. If they're global software engineers, I don't visit any that don't do at least some time shifting these days. And this is the gorilla in the room. We're not managing this. We're not thinking enough about time shifting, even though everybody does it. So this is very important. Let me introduce to you another kind of time shifting. It's very similar to the first, but there's one key difference, and I'll come back to this. Basically, both sides stay in their regular work hours, their normal work hours, but one of the sides, in this case the orange team or individual, also works during the time shift of the yellow group here. All right, so now if we have to manage time shifting, we have to think about it more methodologically. And so in our book, which I think that you mentioned, you'll all get a copy of this book. There are, I use an acronym called SHIFT to describe this. So how do we manage this? Are we time shifting in a standardized format? In other words, do we have a rhythm of time shifting in the group or the team? H is how long? What's the duration of the convergence window? Is it half an hour at the end of a shift, or is it a good chunk of 3 or 4 hours? I are the number of individuals who are involved in the time shifting. Is it just the scrum master, the team leader, the project manager, or is it the entire team? And finally, frequency. How often is this done? I've come across one situation where they do it actually twice a day, once at the beginning of the day, very early, and once at the very end of the day. More often it's once a day, or a couple times a week, or even just once a week, but there is some frequency there. Let me talk a little bit about the convergence window. There are 2 dimensions to the convergence window. This is when the people converge, when they resolve those disagreements, when they discuss those fuzzy and difficult concepts. One is for planned meetings and handoffs. That's the structured part. But the other is the open window, as I like to call it, the open convergence window, which is important for ad hoc communication between the individuals. And now, we in global software engineering, we've been studying for years how to make this overlap, a better overlap, through various awareness techniques. And this is where you can make a difference. You create dashboards. You set up videos so that the different sites can see each other. you build situation awareness into your sites so that they can feel each other, so that they can communicate better. And that's the essence of the convergence window. Let me point out one more aspect of time shifting, and that's the key time shifter is someone that I call the liaison. In this case, it's the time liaison, and the ambassador, if you will. And I want to point out how our managerial notions have changed. That's the acronym over here at the bottom, MBWA and so on. So decades ago, somebody invented this term MBWA. The notion was that a good manager is the kind of manager who walks around in the organization and talks to the people, doesn't stay behind his or her desk. So MBWA stands for management by wandering around, sometimes also called management by walking around. That's how we used to teach management. Well, in the 1990s, when I wrote my first book about this topic, I coined the term MBFA, management by flying around. At that time, it was the elite global software engineers that were beginning to form into these global software teams, and they could afford the plane ticket to fly around. Well, now we have millions of people involved in global knowledge activities. Clearly not all of them have the money to pay for tickets. So now we practice, and we probably will practice for some time, MBTA, which means management by time shifting around. Management by time shifting around. That's what you and I will be doing. Now, this leads to an understanding of two terms here, scatter time and nomadism. Scatter time is on the time dimension. Nomadism is on the location. Scatter time is on the time dimension, yes, and nomadism is on the geographical dimension, or vector, if you will. So scatter time is a term that we introduced in this book. It means spreading out your work into scattered chunks of time, broken up by home and personal time. So you recognize this, and we academics, we do this all the time. We wake up in the morning, we make a phone call, we do some email, then we do personal time, right? Taking the kids to school, getting them breakfast, then we work some more, then we go shopping, then we work some more. So we're scattering the time. The old 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 is all history by now. So that's scatter time. And now many of us in this business, we work scatter time. It changes the structure of work quite radically. Nomadism is changing the location of work. We no longer go to a central office to work. We might work at home or in a third location, such as a cafe or an airport. Now, both of these are now familiar, but we're not managing them well yet because they have profound impacts on work-life balance. Number 5 about time zones is scheduling a meeting. Those of you who are experienced, you probably already know some of this. Far-flung is very difficult to schedule. In fact, it's basically impossible. Somebody has to wake up in the middle of the night in order to attend a meeting when there are more than 2 continents involved. And there's no solution. There is absolutely no solution to that. So the best way to overcome issues across time zones is to use a rhythm. A regular weekly meeting is very important because negotiating that time slot takes a lot of energy to do. And so how do you do that from a mechanics perspective? Those of you who don't know these tools, write them down, timeanddate.com, everytimezone.com, worldbuddy.com. All of these have very nice user interfaces for finding the optimal time, the one with the least pain across time zones. So here you see how that's highlighted over there. And of course, get to know all the time zone features in your phone as well, especially when you're traveling. All right, I'm going to move to the last 5 items for the global software engineer, and all of these are under the common title strategy. Now, time zone and strategy haven't come together a lot in discourse, in managerial discourse, and that's one of the introductions to this topic. One of the new topics that we do in our book is to think about that. Time zone has an implication on how countries compete, yes, countries, how industries compete, and how individual companies compete. And let me start with countries. So here you see India and Brazil and New Zealand. So the New Zealanders say that they have the best time zone in the world. Do you know why? Because every day begins in New Zealand. They're closest to the international date line, except for a few small islands in the Pacific, of course. So if you're in finance, then that's where you should set up your financial center, because the day begins there. When I first went to India, the Indians had already internalized that they have the best time zone in the world. Why? Because they work while the Americans sleep. Okay? And they all repeat this mantra. They all believe in that. Then I went to Brazil, and the Brazilians say they have the best time zone in the world. Why? Because they're awake while the Americans are awake, so they can actually talk to each other. So everybody says that they have the best time zone in the world. Now, in fact, what happens in the offshoring business is that the offshoring business has become fragmented, and there's some new learning about offshoring. So some North Americans, instead of offshoring to a faraway location, they nearshore, they seek a supplier that's closer in, so they go to Mexico or the Caribbean or Latin America. In fact, in a study that we did a few years ago, we found 3 big clusters around the world of nearshoring. Now, of course, nearshoring has other dimensions besides time zones, but it does segment around time zones, especially here, actually, in Europe. So in America, the 2 large wealthy countries are Canada and the United States, of course, and their suppliers are in South and Central and South America and the Caribbean. Here in Europe, the wealthy nations are here in Western Europe, and your suppliers are in Eastern Europe and North Africa, by and large. And of course, there's a few wealthy buyers in East Asia, Japan, Korea, and so on, and they have suppliers in their time zones. And indeed, what you see here, here's a list of the competitive advantages of Brazil from the Brazilian Apex, their IT industry. And as you can see here, they say that their advantage in terms of the industry is strong industry domestically, cultural similarities to the United States, and one of them is time zones. How much time do I have? How much time do I have? Okay. So number 7, follow the sun. Follow the sun is the great myth of global software engineering. So let me talk to you about the myth. First, let me just reiterate what follow the sun means. Follow the sun is when I work all day, I finish the work, and I pass my work on to somebody else who continues it as the sun revolves around the earth. So the notion is that we work faster and faster. Okay, so let me do some disambiguation. Follow the sun is about speed, while round the clock is about 24-hour coverage. Why did I introduce these 2 terms? Because these are 2 management approaches that both take advantage of time zone differences in a very profound way, but they are profoundly different. Follow the sun is about speed. The tasks that you do are perhaps prototyping is a common one. The task is creative and constructive, and the coordination challenge is in the handover, handing off the work from one site to the next, many time zones away. Round the clock is about 24-hour coverage to cover something for all day long. The tasks the classic ones are help desk and tier 1. The task is granular. In other words, it's very small. It might take just a few minutes or 10 or 20 minutes. The coordination challenge is actually minimal. You're not handing off unfinished work. So these are very different. Let me introduce you to how crazy, and here's my one Dutch word here, gek, follow the sun is. And gek also caused the slide to be corrupted slightly, so I apologize. So why do I say that follow the sun is gek? First, I have empirical evidence. No one basically does in software follow the sun. Yes, they do round the clock, and for very, very short instances they do follow the sun, but it's simply too hard. Why? If you're in global software engineering, you're doing one of the first 2 here. The first one is called parallel development, where you divide the work into modules, you divide them, you architect them into sites, and each site does their work, and in the end, there's one handoff, one integration at the end. So there's one handoff per cycle. Okay, the second one in the middle there is by phase. So site A does the first phase for a few weeks or a few months, hands it off to the next site How many handoffs are there? Well, in this chart, there's probably 2 handoffs. And of course, I'm simplifying here. So the chek part is follow the sun. In follow the sun, we have at least 2 handoffs a day. If there's 3 sites, there's 3 handoffs a day. And if it's a 6-month project, there's a few hundred handoffs in a half-year project. It's crazy. You can't run a project like that. You only do it, and I want to underline this, for speed, because it is a very difficult thing to manage. I haven't found a true follow the sun project in all the years I've been examining this. It does work for BPO when the task can be structured and granular. This is a diagram from a giant BPO company called Sutherland Global Services, no connection to Jeff Sutherland, who is a co-author on Rini's book. They are a giant American BPO company. They've taken the mortgage origination process, which is about loans, and they've chopped it up into 12 boxes there. Look at that snake diagram that begins at the top left there and snakes over there into the bottom right. And what you could see there is that some of the tasks have been divided up to India and others to the United States. So it's going back and forth across continents, and every time it goes back and forth, we're working basically in follow the sun in that particular instance. So we have some time savings there. Let me take you to the beginning of Follow the Sun, because Follow the Sun is such a myth in global software development, and I've been following it since I first saw this press release almost 15 years ago. This was Lou Gessner was IBM CEO at the time, and he gathered the journalists and he released this press release. IBM is going to do Follow the Sun with something new also called Java. They set up teams in 5 countries, the United States, in China, in Belarus, India, and Latvia, and they ran Follow the Sun for a while. So this is the big press release. What they didn't tell you, IBM didn't do a press release about that, is that they tried it very seriously for several months, and it failed. It didn't work. They went back to the old style, or the common style, of either parallel or face-based work. Okay, so for the rest, you'll have to wait to read the book, because although I'm an expert on time zones, I obviously have not budgeted my time well enough. So I'm going to just go by here quickly so you see it. I wanted to mention Round the Clock, which is about coverage. In the book, you'll read about 24-hour culture. If you truly want to be a global company that's working across time zones all the time, you need to consider as a strategy to look at 24-hour culture. This is not for most companies. And finally, another thing to consider is, if you're not too many time zones apart, to consider what we call real-time simulated co-location, where you're basically setting up teams that are working at the same time and feel as if they're close together because of technology. The end. Thank you very much.